Hey everybody, how's it going? Is anybody a Sega Saturn fan here? Yeah? Anybody on the fence? Yeah, a little bit? No? Do you need some convincing? That's what we're here to do. We're here to convince you to
play your Sega Saturn.
Play your Sega Saturn, or at least consider getting into one. Yeah, so I'm SaturnDave.
I'm TraynoCo, or Patrick.
TraynoCo, Pat, and then of course Adam Koralik.
I'm a YouTuber named Adam Koralik. I'm more of a Dreamcast person, but I am also the guy walking around with the Sega Pluto Saturn prototype. So,
ironic.
yeah, it's very ironic.
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah. You've been playing it for like an hour, so I hope you recognize it.
Right. So where to begin? Essentially, Pat set this panel up actually, and you called it "Saturn is Our Future," right?
Yep, Saturn is our future. And I gave you reasons why you should play the Sega Saturn. Like about a bunch of fan translations, the ease of playing it. I know it's really got a bad reputation for being hard to emulate and really costly games, especially if you want to buy a Mega Man X4 for $400 X4.
Yeah, the market is pretty gone right now. So we'll take questions and comments at the end. But thanks. No, I appreciate that. That's a good way to kick this off. So yeah, as if any of you haven't figured out by now, the resale market on Western Saturn games is pretty ridiculous. I was actually just down on the show floor looking at just fingering through these Saturn games, and I'm like, okay, somebody wants $100 for Bug 2, and so I'm like, what the hell?
Yeah.
So
not recommended to pay $100 for Bug 2.
Typically when I, like at Portland Retro, I would tell people who would come up, they'd be like, oh yeah, so Sega Saturn, was that any good? And I'd be like, well, yeah, I think it's really good. And
I just say no.
I just can't. They're like, I just can't get into it. It's too expensive. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Like, nobody ever said anything about buying the games. I just want you guys to play them, right? I mean, we're at the point now where we are pretty far behind, you being able to buy these games commercially in any format. I mean, now if any time Sega does release games like this, like on the Switch and stuff, we always highly recommend folks do support them financially.
Yeah, there's a lot of games on like the City Connection, the Cotton collections, like Cotton 1, Cotton 2, Cotton Boomerang, a lot of stuff like that.
Right.
Guardian Force, right, is another one. But there's a lot of different ports and stuff like that, and little easier ways to play Saturn. We definitely recommend people play that. But I think this panel is going to be mostly focused on how to play on the actual Sega Saturn hardware, because I know you guys are really into the hardware as well, and just wanting to play some of these games that are really inaccessible to the West, or just fans in general. Because I know it's definitely harder to play some of these RPGs, at least in the native language, in your native languages. There's not a lot of English RPGs, sadly. Which is
so a lot of you guys probably know Adam, but if you don't know me or Pat, who are we? Like, we're just some dudes, right? Well, back in 2017, we decided to form a podcast that would essentially exist for the sole purpose of boosting the awareness of Saturn in the West and like building a community around it. Not just a community of gamers and collectors, but also people who are enthusiastic about programming, like doing fan translations, doing homebrew games, trying to give the Saturn a bit of a renaissance, and like a second chance, because what I feel like a lot of us who maybe went the PlayStation route or maybe went the N64 route, we slept on a 32-bit console that has just a boatload full of great games, and now we have the privilege of being able to experience all those games, and it's like having a brand new retro console for a lot of folks who missed out on it back in 96, 97. So, I mean, and Adam's just tooling around the country with this twirling around the world with this limited edition Sega Saturn Pluto.
It's just a prototype.
It's a prototype.
Sega only made 2.
Oh yeah, so that is limited edition. Okay, that's overselling.
Yeah.
Like, we're not supposed to know this exists. So if anybody saw, during the pandemic, Sega did this presentation for their Sega 60th thing that they were doing, or Go Sega, and they were talking about their history of planets and how they named everything.
Right.
And that's when they showed everybody the Sega Venus prototype.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So a keen eye could tell, if you looked all the way at the end, there was Pluto, and basically the Japanese translation was like, "We don't know where this is." And I'm like, "Well, we do."
It's right there.
We got it.
We got it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put the mic like that, so
Oh, that was it. That's all I had to
picks you
say.
up. Oh, okay. Well, fine. No. But yeah, so where does that leave us? So ever since 2017, we've been doing this podcast. Like the pandemic, we started really pushing the Discord server, inviting more people to come to the Discord server, encouraging people to get involved in doing fan translations, doing patches or hacks, and then doing new original homebrew for the Saturn. And at the same time, Sega Extreme, which is a big, prominent Sega, fan site, programming site, has also been holding like an annual game competition where they encourage folks to submit fan translations and patches and all sorts of cool stuff.
And we recently just judged it, and they actually just came out with the announcements for the winners of it. There's a lot of, I believe there's a few of them that were running, and it's great because there's like these games that people really want to play, like Soul Hackers, Shinigami Tensei games. There's like homebrew games for that. There's just a lot. There's a Silhouette Mirage got retranslated, and now it's got into from the working designs to the English. So people that don't like working designs, there's your out to play Silhouette Mirage now without all the weird puns and stuff in it.
We should probably explain a little history here on this, just because you guys are so ingrained in this.
Oh, yeah.
You were talking about it earlier in your presentation. So in North America, Bernie Stoller, your favorite boy, was in charge of the Saturn, and he had this policy of no RPGs, which, again, you talked about. So there was a ton of Japanese exclusive Saturn games. And when I'm talking about a ton, like the North American library is, what, like 244 or something like that?
About, yeah.
And then there was like 32 European exclusives. Japan had like 1,800 plus exclusive titles.
Lots of mahjong.
Yeah, well, to be fair, a lot of like date sims and stuff like that, visual novels. But the point is, they got a ton of
hundreds of excellent games.
There's a lot of content over there that North America and Europe never saw, partially because Bernie Stoller didn't believe in certain genres. And so basically, through the efforts of what these guys are doing and what other people are doing, they're like Grandia, perfect example.
Yeah.
A game a lot of you know, a franchise I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, does exist on the Sega Saturn. You could have played it if you spoke Japanese, but thanks to efforts like that they've made, you can now play that in English on a Sega Saturn.
And arguably, it's the definitive edition. I mean, we've even talked to John Linneman from DF Retro, and he's gone on record saying, like, because it was designed for the Saturn, it was designed for that VDP2 display processor. Saturn renders 3D. It has its own idiosyncrasies, and it renders 3D a very specific way. Any game that was targeted for Saturn as the platform, that game is going to sing on Saturn. And then if it was ported to PlayStation, they'd have to cut corners because they just can't replicate what VDP2 does on the PlayStation, and vice versa. Any game that was targeted towards the PlayStation, like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, would see compromises when it made it over to Saturn. Now, fans in the community have done a lot to rectify that for the Saturn version. They've fixed things about the resolution, the sprites. They've translated the game.
There's about like 3 different patches, right, for that game?
Yeah, it arguably makes the Saturn version a very compelling version to try now. But for years, so I mean, but where does that leave folks in the community who are maybe thinking about getting into it? For years, Japanese games have been somewhat cheap to pick up, but then there's been the language barrier, right? Well, now we've come into this confluence of Japanese games still being relatively inexpensive, and you also having the availability of all these fan patches so that you can play the games in English now for a relatively cheap price. That is if you actually want to buy the games, and put them on your shelf. What if you don't want to buy the games? What if you just want to try out the games, Pat? What would people do in that case?
Of course, there's a lot of different options. There's several ranging from $20 to $200. There used to be a game where it's like, okay, you either get a mod chip in there, or you buy the expensive option. They have to stay up till like 3 a.m. to get an order because there's only 5 available to purchase, sort of thing. So we've come a long way from that to where now it's like you have so many options, like the Satiator, which is you just put in the back of the Saturn right there. Adam's pulling that out right now. Get one of those, put that in the Saturn.
It's essentially an EverDrive.
If you're familiar with EverDrives or flash cards, it's a single cartridge. You put an SD card in it, and then you've got, like, depending on the size of the card, potentially like every game ever made, and it just loads in the back. And the Satiator, correct me if I'm wrong, is almost 100% compatibility. It's like Lunar, the version that requires the VCD, specifically doesn't work. Right. But other than that, like, almost everything does.
Okay, but here's the thing. Trekkies in the community, who's like a wizard with video compression, has actually made a version of Lunar that looks just as good as the VCD version.
Well, there you go,
I said, you don't even need that, right? So the point is, okay, but Pat, you mentioned like all these price ranges. That's a
Yeah.
lot of info. So for $20, what can somebody expect to get for $20?
For $20, you get something called a pseudo Saturn, which is a cartridge that goes into the slot right there. I don't know.
Ironically, does not work on the Pluto though.
Yeah.
Right.
So
It'll work
if
on
you-
any regular Saturn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want a Sega Pluto, unfortunately, that's not going to be available.
This
to
would be
you.
considered a soft.
Roger's the owner. Roger's gonna be pissed when he finds that out.
Okay, so
Yeah,
a
he's
pseu-
going to be so upset. How's he going to play Saturn now?
a
Like,
pseudo Saturn
burn
cart
some
is
games.
essentially a soft mod. Think like Free McBoot for a PlayStation 2. Is it a memory card or what that you stick in the cartridge slot allows you to boot burned CDs, right? So that's one way to kind of dip your toe into Saturn titles.
And the best way is that you can even just get an action replay and flash it with the pseudo Saturn, so you don't have to. If you somehow have an action replay for the Saturn lying around, just flash it, and you can do it for free essentially if you had it for a long time essentially.
By flashing it, he means you can burn
Yeah.
a CDR and use the hot swap. You can use
You
the
should
swap.
probably slightly go through the history
We
of
should
Saturn
definitely.
disk unlocking.
Yeah.
Like, because you know this stuff. but
Okay.
you're presenting it like they already.
Okay,
know.
okay. So like, if anybody's familiar with the Dreamcast, Sega made
heard of it.
Sega
What's
made
a
a
Dreamcast?
bit of a mistake by including this mil CD support in it, which means that you could just burn any CDR and slap it in there, and it basically will self-boot. It basically will boot on a stock Dreamcast. That was a bit of a blunder, but with the Saturn, for whatever reason, they did a much better job on the copy protection, and it hasn't been
I
broken
would
to this
dispute
day.
that, but okay.
Well, go ahead.
So, from like the TurboGrafx CD was the first commercially available CD-based system.
Yeah.
And for a long time, the concept of disk protection was basically non-existent. So you could, eventually we figured out if you rip those games and just burn them, they would work. So like a Sega CD, for example, has nothing in it. Like you just burn a Sega CD, a stock unit will read it. But by the time the PlayStation and the Saturn were around, companies kind of figured out like we need something to police this. So they used a defect in the pressing process called a wobble. So the data on the disc is anybody can rip it, anybody can burn it. But
True.
the Saturn knows whether or not it's legit based on a defect in the shape of the disc. That's the only thing that tells it if it's real or not. So the very early trick to that is what you guys must be familiar with, the swap method.
swap
Please
trick.
explain the swap method.
Well, the swap method is where you basically open the drive, you would boot it up to a certain point, and then you would open the drive, grab the disk out, and pop in your CDR, right? I think some people have probably heard about that. It's not great on the hardware,
And I love how you're doing it to the prototype.
right?
Well,
I'm
that's,
not.
that's even the worst
I
part.
appreciate the
We're
fact
going to be
that
doing
I'm
a live
not,
demo
but-
of the disc swap trick on the
We
Pluto.
will not.
But needless to say, it does work. And if you do it like once, if you have what Pat's saying is if you have an action replay cart, which is kind of like the memory cart and the cheats and stuff like that, you can flash pseudo Saturn onto it for $0. You have it already. You can do that just by burning a CDR and using the swap trick once, and then you're good to go. Once you do that, you never have to do the swap trick again because your action replay essentially is a pseudo Saturn card.
Yeah.
Well, essentially, you can keep doing the swap trick if you don't mind replacing your disk drive eventually.
But we
for
don't
free,
recommend it.
So,
We don't recommend
There
it.
That's
were
not
mod
recommended.
chips, of course.
Yeah, mod chips like the Phantom mod chip that you just install into the Saturn.
Yeah.
I think they made it super easy to install, so if you guys want to do that as well.
But that
it's
was
pretty easy.
limited. Like it didn't bypass region coding. It just got rid of the wobble detection.
But then you're modifying the hardware itself.
Oh, I know. I'm just talking
And that-
about the history of how
right,
we got to that
right,
point.
right.
And then it was only a few years ago where it was finally truly cracked. There's that story about it took 20 years, but they did it through the BCD exploit.
Yeah.
And then from there, everybody was kind of building around what you're talking about.
Right, like CD block access,
So
basically.
the Saturn, even though it was technically cracked early, wasn't really cracked until just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the birth of the homebrew scene, the translation scene.
Yeah.
Congratulations on your work.
But essentially, to play any homebrew, to play any burned disc, to play any patched Japanese game, you have to BYOB, bring your own boot, or bring your own boot method, basically. You have to have some method of booting the game on Saturn because it will never just, unless somebody reverse engineers, which is going to take a lot of money and determination, reverse engineers that wobble, which I don't ever.
It's a defect physically.
Yeah.
I don't think you really can.
So essentially, it's always going to be just part and parcel, a part of the Saturn experience.
There would be one loophole if you have your own Saturn disk presser.
Yeah, sure.
my
If
guess
you
is
have
you
your own
don't.
Saturn disk presser, okay, fine.
If anyone has one for sale,
Footnote.
booth
Footnote.
104.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a number?
We would be interested
Yeah,
in
104.
purchasing
Next,
that.
I assume 105.
Actually, I'm
and
not even
104
kidding.
yeah.
Like, we would be interested in purchasing that.
Yeah.
No, because we do have, sorry, what?
Do you have a Saturn disc presser? Look right, yes.
You just had a weird look on your face like you knew something.
Technically, I was talking
Anyway.
to Ness here, but no.
Like
So,
I said,
yeah.
we're looking in the market for it, so if you do, hit me up after this panel.
Anyway, go on.
Yeah, but essentially, so you had things like the pseudo cart, which is a soft mod, and folks are been burning discs forever. I know I have, but of course that's a bit tough on your Saturn's laser because the
Little bit.
CDR isn't exactly the same as
Unless
like
you
a
use
press.
Udens.
Unless you use Taio Udens, which you can't even buy anymore. No.
Explain yourself,
Okay,
guys.
okay. Forget about everything he just said. The fact is that CD-ROM lasers are kind of like us. They get old, and we don't see so well when we get old. And
Speak for yourself, Dave.
the disc
You're
laser,
both wearing glasses.
the disc laser ends up having to squint. And yes, my disc laser just burnt out last year after chugging along for like 20 years just fine. I was that arrogant, cocky dude who would be on Twitter like, well, my laser's been working for 20 years, no problem. And then of course, like right after I say that, it stops reading my entire. And I have like a wall of long box Saturn.
Did you knock
games,
on
and
wood, Dave?
They're all. Yeah, I just can't.
You
play.
had to knock on wood first. So you
Well,
didn't
no,
jinx
I
it.
guess I didn't knock on wood. But anyway, luckily we have a plethora of options to not have to use discs. You have things like the Rhea and Phoebe, which Pat was talking about, the things that you'd have to wait at like 2 a.m. in the morning and put your name on a
Yeah,
list.
Those
and
are the first. Those are the first.
those were
first
early days.
ODEs,
Those were
very
early days.
May I ask?
Yeah.
Those are what are known as ODEs, optical disc emulators. You
Yes.
effectively take the disk drive out and replace it with a new piece of hardware where you can put an SD card, or like in the case of the mode, you can actually put an SSD in there if you really want to. And then from there, what's up? Soldering required? Some do, some do not.
So yeah, those early ones like the Phoebe,
Rhea
the Rhea, they
Yeah.
did. So it was rough. Only the most committed people would do that, right?
The mode does not, although the mode's a little annoying because depending on which model of the Saturn you have, which there was like 42 revisions under the hood. Like you think
Yeah.
of the two external ones, Model 1 and Model 2, but under the hood they had a lot of changes.
Yeah.
And depending on which one you had, the mode either needed to have like these two little power cables like injected inside the power supply, or it didn't. And you could only find that out like on their website. Either way, any like normie who can take a console apart can do it. Just it's more annoying.
It's
when
a
you have to shove
ribbon.
those two
It's a
damn
ribbon
cables.
cable. Basically draws 5 volts from the
Yeah.
board, right? So, but I mean, yeah, no, they've come a long way. So you've got a $100 price point thing like the Fenrir. French guy who goes by Sed. He makes the Fenrir. That is a CD drive replacement. You're going to take the CD drive out. You're going to pop in the Fenrir. It doesn't require any technical
soldering.
knowledge. Like
Because it comes with
basic-
the ports for both power type of ribbon cable. So the ribbon cable that is the data from the CD drive to the
Let's see if I have a
board
picture of
itself
it
for the
folks.
Saturn. It's
Yeah,
pretty easy to do. So it's like I've done it like in the middle of the night, like at 3 a.m.
Comes in now.
debug, yeah.
At first, it came in like a 20-pin model and a 21-pin model. Now it's a universal unit. He upgraded it. It's universal.
To explain, 20-pin model, some models of the Saturn have 20 pins, some have 21. Again, there's 42 revisions, so it's
Yeah.
like, look at yours and figure out which one you've got.
For the longest time, the Saturn community has colloquially referred to the oval button Saturn as the Model 1 or Mark 1, and the round button Saturn as the Model 2, because it was a later cost-cutting revision of the Saturn hardware. But in reality, like Adam said, internally there are so many different revisions. Sega was a mess in that way. They were constantly looking for ways to streamline their really ugly design. Like of the first original Saturn, it just had so many problems with it. It was very expensive and inefficient in terms of design.
So basically what they're kind of saying is there's a ton of options to be able to play a bunch of this stuff, but the more expensive it goes, the more user-friendly it becomes. Where
Yeah.
I think that ultimately culminates is the Satiator.
Yeah.
Like this is like what, $250?
That's like 225.
But this is the simplest thing you can possibly do. Like once you put the SD card in there and you just plug it into the back of any Saturn, that's pretty much 100% compatibility with not only the original library, but also the translations, fan patches,
Right.
all the stuff they're talking about, which based on the great work you guys have done and others in that community, you now have access to, again, all these Japanese games that otherwise you would not have had access to.
And I potentially see this coming down in price because of competition. There's a new product on the horizon called the SARO, SAROO, and that is currently a Chinese product. The developer T-Punix, I think it's an open source design, and
Yeah.
a bunch of folks on a bunch of Chinese vendors on AliExpress have taken that design and gone into production with it, and turns out it actually works. And he, being the good guy that he is, continues to update the firmware for all these bootleg devices on AliExpress. But essentially, that goes into the cartridge slot on the top, and the crazy thing about the cartridge slot on the top of the Saturn is that the bandwidth is much faster than the bandwidth of the VCD card. So games boot really, really fast, like really fast.
But there's a
Almost like
caveat.
CPS2 or something, like almost like an arcade
Yeah.
board. The caveat is that right now it's hard for us to recommend because it's very unofficial. But what I'm saying is it's going to drive costs down for all of the options.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to mention, I think the biggest thing is the cartridge slot is not known for its reliability. So, so if you take it in, put
It's
it
a
in,
set it
put
and
out,
forget it
yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah, because you don't want to mess with this cartridge slot too much. It's
Yeah.
very finicky.
You should probably tell them about the Game Shark problem.
The Game Shark problem. Well, back in the day, Game Shark produced cheat carts, that you'd put in that thing, but they never beveled the edge of the cart because, why spend more money beveling the edge? Just nobody will know, right? But that square edge of that PCB edge connector just damaged
Like,
so
it's
many
like this is the
Saturns.
connector how it's supposed to look, and then the other one's just a square. So it's like just cramming into that, and it's eventually going to wear
Yeah,
that out. Like
and
that.
Basically, it bends the pin, so the only thing that works is the Game Shark.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
connector, or it just stretches them out,
Yeah,
to
so
the
basically, never use a Game Shark, and
Yeah.
if you have a Saturn where your cartridge slot's not working, somebody probably put a Game Shark in it.
Yeah, so and if you look at those pins, they are so much tinier than like the Genesis edge connector. You really don't want to mess with that. So, but that's kind of a lot of information.
Yeah, it's a lot of information, but essentially there's many ways and
So
many
what
ways to
do
play the
we
Sega
have?
Saturn.
We have the pseudo cart for like 20 to 40 bucks on Amazon, right?
Yep.
That's a soft mod that'll allow you to boot CDRs.
Mm-hmm.
You could go the mod chip route, but that's kind of late
That's
90s.
kinda
I don't think anybody's doing mod chips anymore. You don't have to mod your hardware. You have Fenrir, which will replace your CD drive for about $100, maybe 120 shipped.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Mode, if you don't mind buying from Terra Onion. They've got, but anyway, there's the Mode, and that'll actually go in your. If you get a Mode, that'll go in your Saturn or your Dreamcast, and it'll work just fine.
Works
and
on PS1 now, too.
with
wow, that's
extra
cool.
hardware though, right?
Yeah, but it does work.
But it does work, and it allows you to boot from an
That's
SSD.
the big thing about the difference here is it also depends on the mechanism by which the thing is reading data.
Yeah.
So something like the RIA is using SD cards. Most of them use SD cards.
Right.
Mode is kind of cool because it does allow you to use a hard drive or an SSD.
Three things. It allows you to use a micro SD. It allows you to use USB.
Yeah.
Or it allows you to use a SATA
Yeah.
hard drive.
So basically the difference there is also the Mode has like its own menu. It has additional features. So each one is different in its own
it's
way.
got a lot of creature comforts, and that's what, about 190
I don't remember.
something. It's about
It's almost
190.
a press of a satiator.
And then you got the satiator, which is like the convention worker's dream because it's literally just plug and play.
We bring it to cons.
We bring it to cons because you could put it in your pocket, and then you can give it to your friend and have him plug it into his Saturn. If you work at cons and stuff like that, it's really invaluable, and it makes it so that people don't have to actually touch the Pluto,
Which you keep doing.
Okay, fine. I thought I was one of those privileged.
You are, but you keep like fondling it, and I heard you talking about
Well-
fingering.
well, that's
earlier.
big-
Listen, Adam's the only one allowed to fondle the Pluto,
That's
okay?
right.
And maybe Roger. I don't know
Roger can
the
do what he
situation
wants.
there.
Yeah.
That's his. Yeah. He can do
But
what he
essentially, there's a lot of different ways that you guys can experience the Saturn library and find out what you like, because if there are genres that you're really passionate about, I guarantee you there's something on the Saturn that is for you. And when you experience those games, I think that I think they kind of sell themselves. And then
You're not paying money for, so they're not really selling them.
Yeah.
well, I mean, then if you want to say, go out and buy a copy of a game that you really like, then that's a safer bet because you're not like spending a ton of money on a potential risk.
So
you might.
let's cycle this back
Yes,
around. So
let's-
part of essentially what he's advocating for is you might have to set the high
Sail
the
high
seas.
of the
Yep.
internet
Yep.
and get some of this stuff. Let's solve the
Oh,
argument.
absolutely. Well, we're talking
Yeah,
about a
but-
console that's 30 years
Yeah,
old.
no,
So.
that's where I'm going with this. So like I've worked with people at Sega in the past. And
Yeah.
The position, of course, never officially is like, oh, that's fine, but unofficially, it's like,
Right.
we're not making money off it anymore.
Yeah.
And here's the simple reality: they're never doing a Saturn Mini.
Yep.
I can tell you that straight up. They're never doing it.
Because the market on that is
gone. The
gone.
market is completely dead.
Yeah.
The only country where that was even remotely viable is Japan.
Right.
But from an emulation standpoint, which I recognize is not as hard as people think it is, it's not there combined with market compatibility.
Not under $100.
No, not under $100. No.
Yeah.
And frankly, a lot of those games, the source code is lost, which is very depressing.
Yeah.
So like a lot of them are never going to get proper re-releases, and it's just we're never going to see like a Sega Saturn collection released on like the modern consoles or anything like that. So a lot of games on that system live and die on this system. And so in a sense, when you're getting them and playing them on a mode or whatever it is, you're kind of preserving history in a way that they're never going to. So while they would never officially say, yeah, go download all our stuff, unofficially, go ahead, is basically the message.
Somebody's doing like Jurassic Park next door or something.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Well, you can play Lost World on this thing.
I advocate that folks try games before they buy, honestly,
Yeah.
especially because look at the Saturn market. Even the Japanese games are going up in price. And you made a point of that, like ever since the pandemic, like
Yeah, the
Japan,
Japanese finally
they figured out
during
what
the
they
pandemic
have.
that
They know what they
Gaijin
have
wanna
now.
buy their stuff.
They're like, oh, Gaijin.
Yeah.
They want to buy
They
it.
wanna
So
buy our stuff.
they've started exporting a lot more, and you have a lot more U.S. buyers going over to Japan and
Not to mention the accessibility now of Yahoo Auctions Japan being a simple click away to do stuff with buy ease. So it's like it's a little bit easier now to be able to buy these games, and the prices being more less accessible because people are all bidding on that from Yahoo Auctions and buy overseas. So you're not getting a lot of good deals anymore, unfortunately.
But yeah, I was one of those weird Sega kids. I was one of those kids who had a Saturn back in the day, and I didn't have any friends that had a Saturn because the schoolyard conversation was either going to be PlayStation or N64, right? So it was me and my little brother, and essentially, like by creating a community now around this console today, we have this opportunity to have a lot of these conversations, to delve into the hardware, learn about what made it unique, maybe even for folks who endeavor to maybe like write software for it, and there are those, like there's an appeal to writing software for the Saturn because it is quite a bit of a challenge, but I'm amazed at folks like Seven Shades, for example, who did CubeCat.
The GameCube, it's like this little indie game where it's like this little cat that just jumps around, you go through hoops, you get balls of yarn. It's a lot of fun. You can come play it at our booth, actually.
Arguably the best controlling 3D platformer on the Saturn. There were like better than the commercial releases that it got. We got Croc, pretty good. I mean, Argonaut was like doing the best they could in early days of 3D platforming. Mario 64 did it better, but I mean, like Seven Shades has done amazing things. XL2, another developer in the community, got Unreal running on the Saturn, like the first couple levels. So there's really no limit to what the fan base is capable of doing, and that's what SHIRO is. SHIRO is a website dedicated to reporting all of the news on a weekly basis.
And then putting these developers that do these games on a pedestal.
Yep,
So
giving them a platform so that their work gets recognized and talked about. Doing a live show every Friday at 3 p.m. Pacific, where we talk about the week's news, like a roundup style thing, and we've
been doing it straight for like 3 or 4 years. So and trust me, there's enough Saturn news to report on. It's crazy.
We never thought there would be.
Well, the thing with the Saturn, and I've said this for years, it was always like this dark horse console in the fifth generation, because like. It's not an obscure thing like the Apple Pippin where like only I know what it is because I'm stupid enough to own one.
Right.
But like the thing is like everybody defined that generation, at least in North America and Europe, as the PlayStation versus the N64.
Right.
But Japan went a totally different way. In fact, people tend to not know that the Saturn beat the N64 in Japan pretty handedly.
Which is kind of crazy.
Which is crazy to think about. But the thing is, like, it's this system that had tons and tons of effort put into it by a company all of us know, and probably had, I know you love your Dreamcast, as do I. I'm sure a lot of us grew up on the Genesis, love that too.
Right.
They had this one in the middle that had equally as solid content, and just not a lot of people have ever really played it or experienced it, largely to your boy Bernie Stoller just making tons and tons of bad choices.
Unfortunately, Saturn is not our future.
Yeah, that's the quote that everybody knows. That's his boy Bernie Stoller.
Yeah.
So Yeah, there's a lot to discover on this system, and thanks to, I would ironically say, due to the complicated nature of digging into it,
Sure.
that challenge made everybody like, well, I want to figure that one out.
Right.
Because the homebrew scene on this system is different than the Dreamcast scene.
Yeah.
Like the Dreamcast scene is so easy to get into that it's not even like interesting to a lot of people anymore.
Right.
Even though I disagree, I love the Dreamcast scene.
No, it's interesting, but there is less of a mystique to it because it's like there's less mystery. You know?
Anybody can do it if they
with,
really want
with
to.
the Saturn, so one thing you guys might be familiar with is the fact that the PlayStation enjoyed a really long life on the market, right? And developers were able to really squeeze every last drop out of what the PlayStation was capable. You look at games like, what are some of those, like, well, Gran Turismo 2, but even later than that,
Like
with
Crash Bandicoot.
Vagrant Story or something like that. Crash Bandicoot.
I mean, they literally like stopped Sony from making a revision because they just made the code so janky.
They
so it's
really
like,
they really had the opportunity to push that hardware as far as it could go late into its life. Whereas the Saturn, because
You
of
gonna hit it with a Sharpie? Are you serious?
can I hit it?
No.
whereas with the Saturn, you know, due to its market failure, we never really saw what it was fully potentially capable of. And that's the kind of mystery that drives a lot of developers today to kind of tap into it and see, like, what exactly could we, because developers back then described it as
I'm watching that hand.
Okay.
What about this
Developers
one? I'm
described
sure.
it back in the day, and developers that we've interviewed have described it as an open sandbox. Like, yes, it takes some, you know, a little bit of assembly knowledge. It takes really solid C coding knowledge, but there's no, like, unlike Sony where they put kind of limitations on you, Sega literally just threw the books at you on each chip and were like, do what you want to do with this hardware. So a lot of developers found that kind of liberating, that they were able to just kind of mess with it and do whatever they wanted, you know. So that's what new developers, you know, in the homebrew scene kind of have to look forward to. Is
Maybe you should explain some of the complicated nature of developing for the Saturn to begin with.
Well, it's got okay, in the Saturn white paper, which was like the way they were trying to sell it to their market share, their investors. They called it a concert of processors. You
That's
know,
an interesting way
an
to
orchestra.
describe
Yeah, they
dual
try to say it's an
processors.
orchestra, all
It's a cacophony of chips.
working together, right? No, but in reality, it's got two SH2s, a master and a slave. They work in cascade, right?
And those are the video
You've also
processors,
got-
right, or the main processors?
You got a VDP1, which is responsible for drawing the graphics once the main processors do all the math for the polygons, right? The VDP1 draws the graphics, and the way that it does that is actually by rendering sprites very quickly. Like, this thing is ridiculous at how good it is at drawing sprites. So good that the 3D that it does is actually just sprites, quads, distorted. So all the facets of a 3D object are literally just square sprites that have been like stretched and warped to create all the facets of the graphics, you know? And then
And
you
if you're
have,
confused, that's the whole point.
that's the whole point. Well, I mean, you know, with standard like OpenGL or standard like 3D acceleration, you'd have like a round object, a polygonal, you know, primitive, and then you'd just be able to like map, use UV mapping to, you know, cover it with like a texture.
Yeah.
But with the Saturn, each facet, each sprite is the texture, like broken out into like tons of little sprites and stitched together. It's so crazy how it draws 3D, but that's its idiosyncrasy.
I would kind of truncate it by just saying that it was a system Sega said, okay, 2D is the future with 3D backgrounds,
Yes.
and then they were told, never mind, just make 3D content, and they were like, it's not built for that. It's
Yeah.
going to be really hard. Too
Sato,
bad.
Sato did not think, even though the arcades were totally full steam ahead with 3D, Virtual Fighter, you know, Virtual Racing, he didn't think that the home console market was ready for it, or financially, or, you know, that 2D games were still, you know, doing really well. And that was a huge misstep, because once they found out that Sony was just not even going to focus at all on 2D, and they were just really going to look towards the future. And that's because Sony didn't have a history to look back on. They didn't have any worry. They didn't have any concerns. Sega had a lot of concerns based on stuff that they had done previously, but with Sony, it was kind of like, they were just entering this market, and they were like, well, we're just going to try this and see what happens. And we have tons of money to fall back on if anything goes wrong, right? So they literally just went full steam ahead with the 3D. And when Sega found out that they were doing that, they were like, shit, we're in trouble. Like, we're really in trouble because the Saturn can do some 3D. Think Virtua Racing, flat shaded polygon games, but it can't push like fully textured 3D graphics. They were like, we need more horsepower.
Yeah, and unfortunately, with them going full steam ahead on that, it kind of hit a snag with the whole the 299 speech, the whole thing. So kind of got a little bit dicey to get the Saturn going.
But as luck would have it, Hitachi completely unplanned. Like, they built in this feature for a second SH2 to be able to work in Cascade. Not something that Sega ever requested. It's just something their engineers put in there. And so Sato was like, yeah, we can make this work. We can actually, using the power of a second SH2, we can kind of like offload some of the work. But the problem is they use the same bus, so they basically are constantly fighting with that bus for time, so it's like to be able to get the most out of the Saturn, Yu Suzuki said you really have to like finely tune how they both cooperate. It's like one has to be doing a task while another one is doing another part of the task, and everything is down to like fine timing, right? So
yeah, honestly, it was the first really console that had like 2 dual processors. I know it's kind of hard to believe now.
Yeah, we didn't have
multi-threading and multi-processors, but like...
Didn't the Jaguar do it first?
Did the Jaguar do it?
The Jaguar,
It has the Tom and the Jerry,
but
two
those are the
different
graphics chips.
I'm not.
Yes,
you
yeah,
clearly
yes.
know more about that subject.
Yes, so it was typical for consoles to have 2 graphics processors. The 3DO had 2, and the Atari Jaguar had 2, but 2 central processors, or 2 CPUs. That was unique to Saturn, I think. Well, it was common on arcade hardware, actually, which is why. And actually, when you think about it, Sega already had a little bit of experience with the Sega CD, because in that case you have a CPU in the Sega CD and in the Motorola in the Sega Genesis itself, and those would work together. So they did have a little bit of experience to draw from when it came to that. And of course, they do the same thing with the 32X.
And the 32X CD combo games, so they had 3.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah, all
my
6 of
favorite.
those games.
But essentially, they created this. It was like a last-minute Hail Mary to kind of try to like save this project that they've been working since like '92 on, and so they threw in that second CPU probably 6 or 7 months before go live.
Yeah, and it just caused a ton of issues. A lot of developers we've talked to in the past had a lot of issues because the documentation was there, but it was in Japanese. There wasn't a lot of
and
US
also
documentation.
Yeah, so the time that they would have spent creating development tools and English documentation, instead they spent that time putting in the second, like revising the motherboard, basically. So that's the time that, had it been all set in stone, they would have spent that time creating graphics libraries, development kit tools, and English documentation. But instead, they
away
had
with
to,
that.
I'm gonna just troll you now.
Sorry,
But yeah,
Roger.
that's the story in so many words. I know I'm pretty verbose about it, but
Yeah, no, essentially though, with all that added up and issues with Sega in general, it was just a recipe for disaster for getting games not only in the West, but just games on the Saturn in general for a Western audience. So
We
you know,
have to also acknowledge the other elements of that, like its cousin, the 32X.
yeah.
well, Sega of America didn't want to do the Saturn. They were like, no, we're still doing great with the Genesis. Everybody's buying it still.
Well, what's
know?
even dumber about that is the 32X is often considered like America's idea. It wasn't. It was designed by Sega of America at the behest of Sega of Japan.
Right.
Because this is legit. The Japanese thought the Atari Jaguar is the future. We have to jump on that. And that's why they wanted a cartridge edition, because they're like, keep the Genesis alive and then eventually replace it. It was a stopgap. But the stupid thing about that was the timing. So the Saturn comes out in Japan on November 22nd, 1994.
Right.
The 32X comes out on November 21st, 1994 in North America.
Right.
Because of time zones, that's the exact same day.
Right, because Nakayama held held an investor conference like about close to a year prior, basically trying to sell all the investors, especially Japanese investors, on the idea that they were going to go ahead with this plan of doing a split strategy, 32X in America, Saturn in Japan, because, like I said, America was vehemently, they fought tooth and nail against the idea of bringing Saturn out yet. They were like, yes, we want it, but like hold off, because we think we can still sell the hell out of the Genesis.
What's stupid about that too is that the 32X, when everybody believed for that like 1 year that it was around, that it was Sega's next gen console. I mean, you yourself, you bought one. We all thought that was their next system, and then the corporate decision kind of changed. It was like, get rid of the 32X, do the Saturn, because it's working in Japan, so it's going to work in America. We know that market just as well.
Well,
It's
yeah,
like,
because they were completely wrong. First of
Obviously.
all, globalization, right? Gamers weren't stupid. They were getting information. They knew that the Saturn was out in Japan, and they were like, I can spend 150 right now on a 32X, or I can just, they're going to put out this next gen console soon. They must put it out soon, because that's just how game cycles go. It comes
I mean, you
out in
never know,
Japan.
Dave. They could have been really big fans of Knuckles Chaotix and Doom, the only two good games on that system.
The fact is, most gamers didn't buy it. Most gamers didn't buy it, and there are plenty of accounts of Babbage's employees saying that it literally just sat there on the shelves, and then Sega had to buy it back because Tom Kalinske made this. Tom Kalinske was good at a lot of things. One thing he was really good at is selling stuff, right? But oftentimes he would have to make sacrifices or compromises or even deals with the devil to be able to do that. And one thing that he did, which could have worked brilliantly, but it backfired on him so bad, was to be able to have the same preferential treatment as Nintendo by the big box retailers like Walmart and Toys R Us. He had to agree that any unsold stock they would buy back, Sega would buy back. And he, at the same time, they had to agree to hold in their warehouse enough stock to resupply those retailers at a moment's notice. So they had all of this excess inventory in their warehouses, and they had this agreement on the table that in order to be put right next to Nintendo on the shelves of Walmart and Toys R Us, that they had to promise to buy back all unsold inventory. So that is what caused all of the accumulation of bragging rights, I guess, all the profit that was reported by Sega of America in 92 and 93 to end up turning around and being a huge deficit. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in 94.
94 is the most insane year in Sega history. The launch of the Saturn, the launch of the 32X, the launch of the Pico, the launch of the Nomad. No, that was 95. The CDX came out that year. Genesis Model 2 hit a lot of European countries that year. Like, it was insane the amount of hardware they put out in that 1 year.
It's like the Wild West of
It
gaming.
was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And
So
that
they
was when
should
they
have stuck with
started
one.
on this.
Literally, I describe it as the Wild West because, and a lot of you guys look like you're old enough to maybe remember that time. Like, it was like, remember, where people like doing the land rush, they were like staking their claim on land. It was like
Oh, the gold
free
rush?
for all.
No, the Land Rush. I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so
There's
like
a Tom Cruise movie about it.
So right,
Die Hard?
Far and Away or something.
Yep.
So essentially,
Old people references.
So essentially, Tom knocked Nintendo down a couple
Tom
pegs.
Kalinske, not Tom
Tom
Cruise.
Kalinske,
Not Tom Cruise.
not Tom Cruise.
I mean, it could be Tom Cruise.
Sega
Never
of
know.
America did effectively knock Nintendo down a couple pegs, and all of a sudden there was a power vacuum. Whereas Nintendo had just enjoyed market dominance for years. Now all of a sudden, players like 3DO and Sony, everybody was starting to like raise an eyebrow and be like, we could like jump into this dog pile and actually maybe do well, like
Yeah.
I like how you left out Atari.
Atari.
they did it.
No, they did it.
The
CDI,
fifth gen-
CDI,
that was fourth
Atari.
gen.
Okay.
Fifth generation is very weird because there were so many companies that just jumped into it thinking we can make a game console too. Atari's like, we're the old school dogs. We can come back. And he's right. 3DO, that was a weird idea where like EA basically said like, what if we get every other developer to just agree to make one piece of hardware? Like
a VCR.
Yes, essentially it was standardization of video games. Rather than have this stupid competition between consoles, what if there's just this one format, like DVDs, and everybody just agrees to that? That was their idea. Apple, eventually, their one and only console.
There's Scottie Pippen.
Yes.
But all of those consoles had something in
They
common.
did, but and the other thing is, and everybody's like, we accept PlayStation as this like standard now, but back then the idea that Sony was just going to throw out a video game console is like, what? Like,
Oh yeah,
it's
a
so
lot of people
bizarre.
thought it was nonsense.
Yeah,
What experience do they have to draw from, right?
Yeah.
And PlayStation. Now, when the PlayStation first came out, I thought that was the stupidest name. It's funny that now it's like Kleenex, right? Or it's like a name
Yeah.
that is so ubiquitous with gaming. But when it first came out, I was like PlayStation.
And the grand irony is Nintendo came up with that name.
Yeah, that
The
is kind of
Nintendo
ironic.
PlayStation prototype came from that.
But they all had one thing in common, and that was multimedia,
Yes.
full motion video, set-top box, the machine that will do it all, right? I think every single one of those machines you mentioned had some kind of VCD
they had
card
some
or cable.
additional
Yeah,
feature
right.
that wasn't games.
Because
but a
they-
lot of time it was just music CDs.
They wanted to sell you on the idea that you were getting like a whole home theater kind of thing, but really it was, in the end, it just being a game console, right?
Sure, in
Yeah,
most cases.
because most people weren't going to buy it for that stuff, but yeah. The Saturn did it too.
Yeah, it did. It has a VCD slot. Like,
And now
Right there,
we're-
that's the evidence of that right there, that whole thing. Just
Yeah.
the whole, this whole idea, like this was supposed to be sold as a sort of multimedia thing, like an internet device thing, and it obviously didn't pan out because it was $532 to manufacture? Or-
Yeah.
if this had been retailed, it would have been $550. It's funny, the story you told about Sega having to buy back the stuff, we
Yeah.
only found that out like a year ago.
We only found that out like a year
From,
ago in a
these
leaked document.
Yeah, leaked emails from '97.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, all got leaked from Sega, and in there also was discussion of the Pluto. It's like the only official reference to it ever.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, yeah, we were gonna have Net Zero, if anybody remembers them.
Net Zero,
They were
yeah.
building their own custom OS for this thing that was essentially like. It's Sega Channel, the modern version of it, but
Right.
think of it as like Xbox Game Pass. That's what they were basically trying to develop with this thing. We don't have that software, sadly, so we can't try that. But like, they also revealed it was going to be $550, which $550 in 1997. Keep in mind that in 2006, only 9 years later, the PlayStation 3 came out at $600, and everybody thought that was the most insane thing ever.
Yeah.
So go back further, no chance. So Sega was correct to ultimately not allow it to be released because it would have. I mean, you think about the Saturn and how much it's associated with flopping. Imagine if this had come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine they buy that back for $550 a
I think
piece.
when I took this over to Sega Europe, they did make that joke, but they also made the joke about like our lawyers seizing it.
Yeah.
But, obviously, I still got it. So
Did you fight them off?
no, they were very nice about it. They're like, "Oh yeah, come in. This is awesome."
Isao Okawa, the president of CSK, which was Sega's parent corporation in Japan, he was always really big into communications. Like ultimately, he wanted Sega to be kind of like a communications company, and so networking online was something that he had hoped to do since like back in the Genesis era. And they tried with like the Mega Modem, but that kind of failed.
Mega Modem was for the Mega Drive.
Was for the Mega Drive in Japan, and it literally just kind of used the serial port on the back of the Genesis to send like button presses, right? But it was just way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Even the NetLink, even the X-Band stuff, was way ahead of its time.
That would
If
be the online
If
Saturn
Sega was anything, it was always like way ahead of their time,
Yeah.
almost to a fault, because they were always ahead of where the market was. And the thing is, they were trying to push the market in that direction, Then Sony PlayStation 2 would follow suit, and it would be a huge hit, because they would. But I mean, Sega did it first, like they packed in a modem with their Dreamcast and gave the internet to everybody basically. Like that.
I'm still going to it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to show them the back because kind of like a
get the thing out
so
further
kind of
than
like
that.
so kind of like a PlayStation 2 has like the removable hard drive bay. This did it first. And essentially there were games in Japan like Dragon's Dream, which was it was like a MMORPG that was cross-platform with PC. So they used the same servers as PC players, and they could play. And the
Right.
idea.
So yeah,
Like-
it had a built-in modem. Like I said, the idea was kind of like Sega Channel. You would have been able to directly access the internet, and they also built a hard drive into it. This is a 520 megabyte hard drive, which I know is laughable in 2024, but like this
That was
is
massive.
top of the line PC level stuff at the time.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, incidentally, fun fact: this hard drive in my hand currently is the first one in any video game system in human history.
Mm-hmm.
It is in right here in this room with you.
Yeah.
And I mean, this was 5 years before the Xbox did this.
Right.
Like, Sega was way ahead.
Right.
So we can only speculate to some extent what they really wanted to do, but from everything I've gathered from these emails, from talking to anybody over there who knew anything about it, and just kind of honestly using it, the plan was basically Xbox Game Pass for the Saturn in 1997.
So, speaking about the modem, I know there was also a modem accessory,
The Netlink.
Earlier for the regular Saturn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that back when SegaNet was still active on the Saturn, do you think you would have been able to use that modem to connect to SegaNets?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the modem, just to be clear, the modem cart was a compromise. That was what they were able to put out
Yeah,
because they couldn't put out
couldn't
this.
release this.
So they put that out as a bit of a compromise. It used Catapult, which is a California company. It used their X-band service to connect people over phone lines. And they went over to Japan and they did the same thing over there, helped them get set up on there. And they had a thing called SegaNet or Sega Networks. But it also used X-band. At the end of the day, that was the underlying technology, was X-band. And folks, over there they had servers governing everything, and they had like cards that you would top up at Lawson's or something like that. Whereas over here, you would essentially just.
Lawson's is a Japanese convenience store.
It's like 7-Eleven in Japan.
You suck at explaining yourself. You gotta do this. But be more confident.
He's totally right. I do suck at explaining myself.
Well, no, be more confident. I also said that part. Okay.
Oh, I'm confident in my inadequate explanation of things. So
You need self-esteem. Do better.
What's up?
You. Yeah.
You have a question?
So basically, it's more of a, I guess, a comment, but something I realized is the Sega Saturn, like, games, that when I was playing on that system, it kind of reminds me of the GBA, just a little bit, because, like, the graphics.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent
Because
comparison.
basically, up until basically the PS3 era, 3D graphics were kind of gross, especially a lot of games. I mean, not all of them, but, like, like, a lot of games, do you know, like, Dark Undertone on the PS1 and PS2? 3D games. Looks ugly, right?
Kind of grungy, yeah, a
The
little
Sega
bit grungy.
Saturn is that mine's a GBA in a way where, while competitors were all making like really ugly and mushy 3D games, they were basically upgrading. They basically were a direct sequel to the 16-bit graphics, but so it was basically like 32-bit 2D sprites, and obviously that basically means that it was basically the best 2D games to get before everything switched to 3D.
It's kind of an interesting point because like Gunstar Heroes has a sequel.
It's
on
true,
it, too.
so does-
Gunstar Heroes was a big Saturn game, but
So does Guardian Hero.
yeah, there you go. So in a weird way, because I mean, Nintendo did market that as a 32-bit platform, but it's like
Yeah.
the ultimate 2D platform.
I would argue that there's a lot of similarity in the GBA and arguably the DS. There's a familiarity in those games, and I'm a huge DS fan too. And I've often said like I feel like a lot of those games are reminiscent of Saturn games in some ways. But you had a question?
I do. So within the Dreamcast community, and I'm probably butchering this, but I did it by myself. So Callisti OS is kind of the way that I stick a broadband adapter in there, and then I run code and send things to it, and I can do little programming and stuff. Is there an equivalent for Sega Saturn that you recommend that's kind of at that level of development?
A lot of them are right now. They're sent by the cartridge slot or something like a USB over the satiator. I think the devs usually think the satiator USB for debugging and stuff like that when they do the builds. And you send it over that way. I know that
You're talking about like
for developing builds,
For
right?
development, yeah. If you want, like, on the Dreamcast, use Callisti OS, and you can do development on it. Is there like a
yeah, like
kind of pre-made development kit very similar to that for the Sega Saturn?
so there's
the
Joe
closest,
Engine.
Yeah. Joe Engine, yeah.
Yeah, so Johannes Fetz, do you want to take this one, Pat?
Yeah, so basically Johannes Fetz was a developer of the Saturn, noticed, oh, this system is pretty hard to develop for, so he went and created a sort of a SDK or a environment to be able to build code and send it a little bit more easier, and like a developed framework to be able to create code a little bit easier and create games a little bit easier. And a lot of people have been working on their own little engines. There's engines here and there for like text-based adventures and stuff like that. So that's sort of the go-to is the Joe engine and a lot of modifications on top of that. And then there's a lot of add-ons with that, like Pony Sound. That's basically a engine that specifically helps produce sound for the system.
sound
things of that
driver
nature.
is-
Sound driver,
yeah,
yeah.
And that's J-O.
Joe engine, yeah, Joe.
J-O engine, and it's kind of, I don't want to call it like training wheels, but it's definitely a place to start. There's a ton of tools, and then there's your ability to just work mostly in C. And what I've seen most developers do is they start there, and then the more confident they get, the more they work away from that and kind of break away. I've seen folks start out using Sega graphics library and get to the point where they actually end up writing their own renderer for the Saturn, and it actually performs much better. Like Seven Shades, he's working in his own rendering pipeline, and he was able to recreate Peach's Castle, the Mario area where he runs around and stuff, and render that whole thing, and it runs great. And so, yeah, it's just insane what folks are able to do on the Saturn hardware.
Aaron?
So I was wondering what you guys thought of, you know, obviously Sonic Extreme was supposed to come out on the Sega Saturn.
Yeah.
How
Mhm.
much do you think that, I guess like a true Sonic game, not being on Sega Saturn in North America, how much do you think that hurt it?
Astonishingly.
Oh, I
Pretty
think
much
it's
a
like
lot, yeah.
maybe
Like-
10%. Like there
Yeah.
because there are so many mistakes that Sega made. I think that accounts for maybe like 10%
Which is
of
pretty
the.
significant
Oh yeah, it's a
percentage of a single thing.
yeah,
I mean,
not having a major, flagship Sonic game.
I would
is-
argue Sonic is the one thing Sega ever produced that cracked that like upper echelon of pop culture to the point where you can get Sonic pajamas,
Yeah.
and, like backpacks. He's got 3 movies now. Like
He's
it's
in
the
Ice Cream
one
Pops.
thing they've ever made that everyone knows, even if they don't really.
And
know
they've
the
sold the hell out of that game
Yeah.
like over and over and over again.
The fact that they had a mainline console after he was a hit that
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
really have a game of his
Right.
is insane.
What,
the-
Sonic Jam doesn't count?
Well, the 3 we've got, we can go over it. Sonic Jam is just a collection of the Genesis games. Granted, Sonic 1 on it's better because it's got the spin dash built in.
Yeah.
Sonic R, which is the only one that was really unique and is not a particularly good game, despite.
Disagree.
I love the soundtrack. I can feel the sunshine all day, but at the same time, the actual gameplay.
You're playing it wrong.
If I'm playing it wrong, it's not built right.
It's not a racing game, it's a platformer, but people don't
not
get
a
that.
well-designed one. And then, of course, Sonic 3D Blast was just like a holdover from the Genesis era. It's like the definitive
no,
edition of
I
a
agree.
game that wasn't that great to begin
And
with.
let's
Yeah.
not forget that Sega didn't just do this with Sonic. They did this with Streets of Rage. They did this with all their other
See, here's the
like
thing, though.
beloved IPs. They didn't put them on the
I would
Saturn.
argue that's actually one of the reasons the Saturn is very unique.
Yeah.
Because every established Sega franchise, they more or less said, nah, that's fine. don't
No,
worry about
let's
that.
do Clockwork Knight
Let's do
instead."
Clockwork Knight. Let's do Burning Rangers.
Knights.
Let's create this thing called Panzer Dragoon. Obviously, Unites. All that stuff that they just built for it that like totally lives and dies on this system.
Yeah.
And then they were like, okay, Dreamcast, let's bring back Sonic and bring back,
Right.
stuff people remember. But,
This was
yeah.
Sonic Team at their
Get
most
the Sharpie away.
this was Sonic Team at their most
Dave,
experimental.
hand me a shirt real quick.
And
No, don't do that.
okay, here.
Thanks.
Yeah. But I mean, why was Sega willing to let them be so experimental? I would argue that it was because, and it was a special time in gaming, where nowadays companies don't make many decisions. They weigh the risk of everything, okay? But back then, nobody knew how to make a 3D game. So they were like, wait a second, the consumers want 3D, but nobody knows how to make a 3D game except for a couple people in our arcade division. We literally need to let people just try whatever because we don't know what the formula, we don't have the secret formula to print dollar bills yet. So they gave developers a very long leash when it comes to developing 3D titles because nobody knew what they were doing.
Yep.
Somebody had a question over there?
Yeah. So, I remember the Saturn had a 4 megabyte
Yes.
expansion card.
Yeah.
What can you say about that? Because I mean, it's not common on the US. I don't think I ever saw it.
I think Marvel Superheroes is the only
Only US.
American release that actually.
And it
uses
doesn't advertise it at all.
It doesn't advertise. It's
Yeah.
like hidden in there. Every
Marvel's-
other release that used it was Japanese only.
Yeah,
I think
there's
maybe one of the
never-
European
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
like a ton, many of the Capcom games in
Yeah.
Japan, like the Marvel, the Street Fighter, Marvel X-Men versus Street Fighter.
Yeah.
It was a little similar, not perfect comparison, but to like the N64 expansion pack.
Yeah.
Like any game that
That's
supported
exactly
it got more out of it. It was
Yeah.
just RAM. That's all it is.
You got more frames of animation. You essentially would, in some cases, get a near arcade perfect port.
I think that you said on X-Men versus
Street
Street
Fighter.
Fighter. Yeah, I think that requires
had
it.
The tag team. Because on PlayStation they have a tag team.
That's right. Yeah.
It was,
So fighting games benefited from it the most because of the frames of hand-drawn animation and also how quick fighting games run. You know, they're so twitchy and so quick. You need to be able to access that information immediately.
Yeah, to be fair, I think the only games that really require it are Street Fighter Alpha 3, and I believe it was some of the King of Fighters games. So I think that's a ROM cart there for a couple of those.
Well, 95 is a ROM cart where,
gotcha.
and Ultraman is the other one where it's like the game data is actually on the ROM, on the cart that comes with the game. So if you try to King of Fighters 95 without the cart, it won't work because you need that data. But then they realized that wasn't a good idea, and they were like, okay, let's just make it a RAM cart, and we'll load the information in to the RAM, and then, you know, it was.
The product that you have over there that runs on the card bypasses that.
Yeah, but folks who are familiar with the Action Replay cart know that you can just use that, and that works as like a 4 meg RAM card, essentially. Yeah.
Ironically, this one will not read the 4 megabyte RAM cards.
Because it's
Prototype.
strange. Yeah.
What can I say? It has built-in additional RAM, but it's not for that purpose, and we don't know what it does. Get that away!
You got another one?
I'm gonna sign it.
Bring out Sharpies.
I'm gonna sign it. Dude. Anyway, yeah, another question.
Yeah, so, what was it? I was related to how, the guy everyone seems to hate from Sega, what is his name again?
Bernie Stoller?
Kalinske. Bernie Stoller. Poor Bernie.
Yeah, so Bernie Stoller, so like, the RPG thing, which that's the thing, it's like, not, like he said,
Yeah.
fantasy and all that.
Right.
I realize it's like, if you were to look at the catalog of Saturn games, or just even more, look at the best Saturn games, that'd be less. They're almost all RPGs or visual novels.
Oh yeah.
You see, like we were talking about, like Soccer Wars, what is it? There's a bunch of them. There were a lot of PC ports.
There's a ton of them. There's a ton of them.
I don't know how that worked exactly, but both the Saturn and Dreamcast had like a bunch of PC visual novels and games and stuff ported over to the system.
Yeah, a few of them did go over.
I mean, Bernie worked at Pepsi before that, right? And like, so what did he do? He like looked at data and he just came to conclusions based on that. Like he was a businessman, right? And he was given a really sinking ship, right? So like that was a bad call. The RPG thing was a bad call, but it was probably based on like market data that he had available to him.
Okay, at the time, RPGs weren't that
And honestly, if
successful
you look at the fan translations that are happening today, you know what they all are? They're all like strategy RPGs, you know? Those are the things that they did not want us to have in the West. And now it's like fans are translating all of them. So we're just getting like they play a lot like, what did you say, like Fire Emblem? Like a lot
the
of Fire
Fire
Emblem
Emblem
type games are coming over.
Soccer Wars, it came out after, like Soccer Wars
Yeah.
influential because remember Soccer Wars was the first, major hybrid visual novel. Like before that, because Persona wasn't out at that point.
Mhm.
None of the big series.
Sure.
Soccer Wars was one of the pioneers in the whole RPG visual novel hybrid thing, and they actually the creator of Persona, several of them actually said they were inspired.
They were inspired by soccer. It was a cultural
Yeah.
phenomenon in Japan. It was actually a system seller. Believe it or not, Sakura Wars was a system seller in Japan, whereas here it's like, so
There's literally a Sakura Wars Dreamcast.
there is a Sakura Wars Dreamcast.
It's very pretty, very
have
pretty.
it.
I have two of them, I don't have the system, but I have the controller.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
But yeah, like the thing is that in defense of Bernie, defending Bernie, I think him saying the visual novels shouldn't really come over. I'm kind of in agreement because I don't think it really caught on to that era of in America. Like I don't think there's a lot of people that were.
Recently, visual novels even big in America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
10 years,
But here's the
Yeah.
interesting thing I want to leave with you guys is that like we know the stories of the Nintendo 64 because those stories were loud. The PlayStation, it's like there's very little mystery left in the PlayStation because it was the victor, and the victor, like we learned in school, everything that happened based on like, we hear mostly about the people that won, but what about the
History is
people
written by
that
the winner.
lost, right? So the Saturn, it just, and I'll keep the pen away, but I feel like,
better.
I feel like there's just still so much that we
use
can
this to
discover
defend.
about it, and there's so much mystery there.
Defense.
That it makes it a very interesting console, and it's one I hope that more people, dip their toe into the library, find out what they like, and maybe, you know, consider buying a Saturn. You don't have to buy one with a working CD-ROM drive anymore. You can get one on discount for like 20, 30 bucks. Our friend Sega Steve at Portland Retro Gaming, he was like
giving them
he was
away,
like 20
essentially.
bucks for burned out laser Saturns, but everyone's just going to grab that CD-ROM drive and replace it with a Fenrir for $100 anyway, right?
We should also mention there is some future proofing. Like Sega put RGB in this thing.
It has RGB,
So you can
yeah.
get like a very clean, clear signal out of it. I mean,
Beautiful,
you
yeah.
I'm not going to suggest these as recommendations, but there are direct HDMI output devices
There
for
are,
the Saturn.
yeah.
I would recommend doing something better.
There
but
are-
like, point is, entry level
Yeah.
can actually
Even
be very good.
S-Video
Well,
to a CRT looks
Yeah.
amazing
Okay,
on the
that's
Saturn.
different,
S-Video to a CRT on the Saturn, totally good. Highly recommend.
I think the only one I'd recommend is the Rad 2X. It's probably the only one I'd recommend.
Yeah,
for
if you're
one
going
that-
if you're going to a,
Yeah.
if you're going to an LCD or OLED, the Rad 2X cable is a great product.
My PVM has S-Video and OLED.
Well, yeah. There
Yeah,
you go.
well, yeah, you know, the S-Video out of Saturn is very clean. It's very good. It's a good option.
So we're technically
We're
over
technically
our time,
over
but
time.
nobody seems to be coming in after
Yes.
us. So I guess we could do a couple more questions
Yeah.
until somebody comes for
Anybody
us.
else?
What's y'all's favorite Sega Saturn game? That's not bad.
So mine has been Nights into Dreams ever since 1997, and so there are so many Saturn games that I love a lot, but Nights into Dreams means the most to me, just because that's the game that got me into Saturn. I was standing in an N64 or Mario 64 line, and I just happened to see Nights into Dreams off to the side, and I got out of the line, and I was like, oh my god, I don't think I want a Nintendo 64 anymore.
I think that at one time my answer also was Knights for the same reason.
Yeah.
It was also like the one game that
It's so
I was
different.
like that I was like I kind of want to go get a Saturn for just that, like
Right.
retroactively.
Yeah.
But over time I kind of fell out of love with it. The one I ended up falling in love with later is Astral, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
a game I don't think it's enough credit. I like that.
First-party Sega game.
Yes, the reason I like that game so much is it is the unrealized original intent of the Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
2D game, 3D elements, beautiful and fun.
And great music, too.
Yeah, it's a good game.
It's an excellent game. Highly recommend it.
If I had to pick one other than Soccer Wars, of course, I have to say Police Knots because I'm a bit of a fan of it. Little tiny,
But
little
wait,
tiny bit of a fan.
the game that got him into it was
Virtual On, so it's also a good
with
option
the
as
twin
well. I
sticks,
love-
you know. Yeah, because
And Police Knots has been translated.
Exactly. so
Oh,
you
and
can
it's
play
the
it in
definitive
English.
edition too. Like the definitive version of Police Knots is on the Saturn. Junker HQ did that
Translation
on multiple
for that,
consoles, right?
yeah.
Yeah, but the Saturn version is the best.
Can you use the stunner on the
Yes, yeah, you can use the stunner. There's a shooting mode.
And
yeah.
the mouse too.
And the mouse. Yeah, yep.
I think you had a question.
I had a comment and a follow-up question. I was intrigued when you said how nobody knew how to make 3D home games yet. And I remember.
That's hyperbole, but yeah, no.
I do remember from that era that it was happening. That it seemed like when my friends and I would be shopping looking at games, it seemed like we got to try some out. There were a lot of them that seemed like some developer was told, "Okay, your idea is good, but shove a lot of 3D into that."
Right.
The result was not always great.
Which is one of the reasons they might not have wanted to go with their prized IPs, because it was so experimental and the game might have sucked. So they were like, let's try these ideas out on new IPs that don't sully the reputation of like Streets of Rage or whatever. What you get is all of these new IPs like Clockwork Knight and Knights, and you know, because Sega was like, I don't know if we want to just like experiment with like the best we have to offer, and then nobody ever wants to play a Golden Axe game again, you know.
Yeah.
How do you think that experiment of just telling developers to try stuff worked out on Saturn? Is there a lot of, is it mostly good stuff, or are there a lot of games where you're playing and you're like, you know what, this would be better for TV?
Honestly, if you look at the library in Japan and America, you could see that a lot of Japanese developers that had the documentation really did a good job in the 3D games, and it's like blows your mind. It's fantastic. And the ones in the U.S. that didn't really have that many great 3D games, to be honest with you.
It's about half
So,
and half.
yeah.
There's plenty of crap on the Saturn, don't get me wrong, but there's so much good stuff that it far outweighs. Like Bulk Slash, for example, is a great example of a game that marries 2D and 3D perfectly. And it's such an amazing game. I recommend you guys play it. It's been completely English dubbed with like voice actors.
And these are
everything
famous
like that.
ones too, like people that are in actual games, like Kraken Academy and stuff, or
Yeah.
or anime that you can watch right now.
Yeah.
kind of insane, the people that volunteered for the project.
But yeah, if you slept on the Saturn back in the day, you're lucky because you are about to discover so many great games, at least, I don't know, 500 to 800 games, depending on your taste, that are good, solid, like 80% or greater games. Like there's just so much good stuff on the Saturn, you know, so I highly recommend you guys check it out and maybe join the Discord community. And there's a ton of people who would love to answer any questions you have or, you know, help you on your discovery, on your journey of discovering the Saturn, you know?
Exactly, yeah. And if you guys want to talk to us at our booth downstairs, that's 104. It's just like right in the corner next to John Hicks and John Hancock.
John Riggs and
John Riggs. That's it.
not
John Hicks. John Riggs. Why did I say John Hicks?
You combined them.
Oh, I did? Oh. I guess, yeah, sorry. But anyways, right next to them, just go talk to them, and we're right there. We'll answer any questions you have, and you can demo whatever game you have. We pretty much have every fan translation on there, every homebrew, so if you guys want to try something, look through the list, see what tickles your fancy, you can, and go play it.
If you go to our website, SegaSaturnShiro.com, and it's on this magazine, I'm going to give this to some of you guys, SegaSaturnShiro.com. It'll provide you with all the information you need on how to get your Saturn online, how to play games, what all the patches are, and all that stuff. If anybody didn't get a copy of the magazine, I know some of you guys did, but I have a stack here, and I'm giving it away for free if you guys want to grab one. I don't know if I have enough for all of you because I didn't know that many people would show up. but for those of you who already have one, don't double dip. But yeah, you guys are free to come up and grab one. We can even sign it for if you want.
No, the Sharpie's over there.
Well, I've got
I can sign it. I have the power.
Sharpie. I can still sign
Thank
it.
you everybody for showing up.
Thank you very much.
SEGA SATURN SHIRO